She was still wearing the dress when she walked into the dark. Not running, not crying, just walking. One foot in front of the other. Out through the church doors, past the rows of white ribbon and candles, and the faces of every person she had ever trusted. All of them turned slightly away, all of them knowing what she had not known until 20 minutes ago. The rain had already started. She did not feel it. She did not feel much of anything yet. That would come later, somewhere on a Montana highway with nothing but black mountains on either side, and the wipers going, and her hands completely steady on the wheel in the way that hands sometimes are when the rest of a person has already shattered. She drove until the gas ran out. Then she walked. By the time Evelyn Carter reached the valley floor, the rain had turned mean, sideways and sharp, carrying the cold of the high peaks inside every drop. Her dress, the one her mother had quietly paid for over 8 months without ever mentioning the sacrifice, was soaked through and dark at the hem with mud and blood from where the barbed wire fence had caught her in the dark. One heel had snapped off somewhere on the gravel road. She did not remember when. She had stopped paying attention to herself the way you stop paying attention to a house you have already decided to leave. She was not looking for shelter. She was not looking for anything. And then she saw the light. It was a single amber glow coming from a low barn at the edge of a muddy field, the kind of light that looks in the dark and the cold and the absolute end of everything, almost exactly like a reason to keep walking. She stood at the field's edge for a moment and looked at it. Then she went toward it because it was the only direction she had left. The barn door was heavy and old, and it groaned when she pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Hay and animal warmth, and something beneath that. Something wrong. Something her body recognized before her mind named it. The cattle inside were not well. She could see it immediately in the way they stood, heads low, breathing labored, eyes glassy with the particular vacancy of animals that have stopped expecting relief. She counted 8 in obvious distress, but it was the horse at the far end that stopped her completely. He was a bay gelding, old, his muzzle gone gray, and he was pressed against the back wall of his stall in the posture that Evelyn had seen only a handful of times in her life, the posture that meant an animal had made its peace with dying. She crossed the barn without thinking. She pressed her palm flat against his neck, and she began to talk to him the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 and kneeling in the wet grass beside a calf that was not going to make it. Low and slow and without pretending. Just sounds that said, "I am here, and I am not leaving, and you do not have to be afraid." The horse shuddered once beneath her hand. Then, he turned his head toward her. That was when the barn door opened behind her, and the cold came rushing in, and a man's voice said, very quietly, "Step away from that animal, right now." She turned around slowly. He was standing in the doorway with a shotgun leveled at her chest, and he was not a young man, and he was not afraid, which was somehow more frightening than if he had been both. He was past 60, built like someone who had been shaped by decades of weather and loss and physical labor that never fully stopped. Silver hair beneath a dark felt hat, a jaw set hard, eyes that were not angry, eyes that were something past anger, exhausted and certain. The eyes of a man who has already lost the things that mattered most and has made a cold peace with the idea of losing more. His name was Wyatt Brooks. He had not slept in 4 days. "I said step away." "I know," Evelyn said. She did not move her hand from the horse. "But if I do, he'll go back to where he was, and where he wasn't going to make it to morning." Wyatt stared at her. His eyes moved slowly over the ruined dress, the bare feet, the blood dried dark along the hem, the hay already caught in her hair. He said nothing for a long moment. "Who sent you here?" he said, still not a question. "Nobody sent me. I was walking. I saw your light." "Nobody walks through Bitterroot Valley at midnight." "I know," she said, and then, very quietly, "I didn't have anywhere else to go." It was not the words, it was the sound beneath the words, that particular frequency of exhaustion that belongs only to people who have been broken very recently and are still in the first hours of shock before the grief has fully arrived and while the body is still running on something it doesn't have a name for. Wyatt heard it. He lowered the shotgun 2 inches, not all the way, but 2 inches, and he stayed. Wyatt Brooks had come to the Bitterroot Valley 23 years ago with his wife Clara and almost nothing else, just a truck, a trailer, some tools, and the particular stubbornness of 2 people who had decided that a piece of land was worth building a life on, 1 season at a time. Clara had planted a kitchen garden that first spring. Their daughter Lucy had been born upstairs in January during a storm that closed the roads for 3 days, and Wyatt had delivered her himself by lamplight with his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold them still. Lucy had learned to ride before she could read. Clara had kept the books and argued with the feed suppliers and made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and never once complained about the winters, even the bad ones. They had died together 7 years ago on the mountain pass above town. A winter storm, black ice. The truck had gone off the road in the dark, and Wyatt had found them 3 hours later. He did not speak about it. He had never spoken about it to anyone. He had poured every remaining piece of himself into the ranch, because the ranch still needed him every morning, whether he wanted to get up or not, and that need, animal and practical and completely indifferent to his grief, had been the only thing that kept him vertical. And now his cattle were dying, and he did not know why. And 3 neighboring families who grazed their herds on his land were watching him with the careful silence of people who are afraid to say out loud what they are most afraid of. By dawn, Evelyn had not slept. She had moved through the barn slowly and carefully, checking each animal with the methodical quiet of someone who had grown up doing exactly this. She noticed things. The way the sickest animals clustered near the eastern water trough. The smell of the water when she cupped it in her palm, faint but wrong, metallic and slightly sulfurous beneath the ordinary smell of a working ranch. She had smelled something like it once before, as a girl, when a creek near her mother's farm had run strange colors after an old mine upstream had failed. When Wyatt came back at first light with a thermos of coffee and the shotgun still over his shoulder, Evelyn was waiting for him at the eastern trough with her arms crossed and her ruined dress covered in hay and her eyes completely clear. "It's your water," she said. "Something chemical is getting into the eastern supply. You need to pull every animal off this trough today. Not tomorrow, today." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "You a veterinarian?" "No, my mother was. I grew up watching her." "Why should I trust you?" Evelyn held his gaze. "You don't. You don't know me. But your horse is still alive this morning, and last night you didn't think you would be." She paused. "Pull your animals off the water. If I'm wrong, you've lost nothing. If I'm right, you've saved everything." He pulled them off the water that morning. The testing confirmed it within 48 hours. An abandoned silver mine 2 miles up the eastern ridge had been leaching heavy metals into the groundwater for months, accelerating through the autumn rains until the concentration had become toxic. County officials came out. Reports were filed. The contaminated trough was sealed, and clean water was hauled in by truck until new lines could be run. And slowly, not quickly, not miraculously, but slowly, in the way that real recovery always happens, the animals began to come back. Evelyn stayed. There was no formal conversation about it. She simply did not leave, and Wyatt did not ask her to. Maria, who had managed the ranch house for 11 years and understood people the way only someone who has watched them suffer quietly for a long time can understand them, brought Evelyn dry clothes and a pair of boots and a blanket, without comment or question. in the way of a woman who recognized that some people arrive at exactly the right moment and asking too many questions only frightens them from leaving. Evelyn worked in the way of someone who cannot afford to stop, because stopping means feeling, and feeling means the church comes back, and the whispers, and her cousin's face at Thanksgiving dinner, smiling across the table while knowing everything she knew. She mended fences in the cold. She moved cattle in the early dark. She sat through the night with the animals that were still weak, talking to them quietly the way her mother had taught her breath making small clouds in the frozen air. The ranch hands, 3 men who had worked for Wyatt for years and trusted strangers about as naturally as the mountains trusted weather, watched her first with suspicion, and then with a respect they showed not through words, but through actions. Passing her the right tool without being asked, leaving hot coffee on the fence post where she worked without making anything of it. Wyatt watched too. He began timing his morning rounds to cross paths with hers. He told himself it was practical. He told himself a lot of things. One evening, Maria found Evelyn in the tack room with the wedding dress across her lap and a needle and thread in her hands. She was not repairing it to wear again. Maria understood that immediately. She was repairing it because it was the last remaining object from the life she had planned, and allowing it to completely fall apart felt like a loss she was not ready to name. Maria sat down beside her without a word and poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one across without ceremony. They sat in silence for a while, and then something in that silence, the warmth of it, the complete absence of judgment, opened something in Evelyn that had been sealed shut since she walked out of the church. She set the dress down and covered her face and cried in the way she had not yet allowed herself to cry. Not the dignified, controlled grief of a woman holding herself together in public, the real kind. The deep and gasping kind that comes from the very bottom of a person and means something is finally letting go. Maria put her arm around her and said nothing, which was exactly, precisely the right thing. "Nobody told me," Evelyn said finally when she could speak. "Not one person. They all knew, and not one person called me. Not one." "I know, mija," Maria said softly. "I know. I just wanted someone to choose me. Just once, just actually choose me." The barn was quiet around them. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. The blizzard came on a Thursday in late November, and it came fast. Temperature dropping 40 degrees in 5 hours. Visibility gone within the first hour. The kind of storm that the old ranchers in Bitterroot Valley spoke about in the particular tone people use for things that have killed before and will kill again. Wyatt was coordinating the emergency movement of the herd to the lower shelter when someone said Danny's name. Danny Reeves, 22 years old, the youngest of the ranch hands, had gone to check the northern fence line 2 hours before the storm turned serious. He had not come back. Evelyn was already moving toward the truck before anyone finished the sentence. Wyatt caught her arm and his grip was firm. "I'll go," he said. "You have 40 animals that will die without you here in the next 2 hours, she said. She looked at him steadily. "I'll find him." "Evelyn." His voice was different when he said her name, lower. Something unguarded in it that she had not heard before. "This storm will kill you." "I know what storms are," she said. "I'll find him and I'll come back, I promise." She found Danny 2 miles north, half buried in a drift against the fence line, his lips pale, his eyes half open and losing focus in the way that meant she had arrived close to the last possible moment. She dragged him into the shelter of a rock formation and wrapped them both in the emergency blankets from the truck and held him against her to share warmth. And she talked to him, steadily, continuously, refusing to let silence take hold. Because silence in that kind of cold is how a person stops fighting. She told him about Oklahoma, about the smell of red dirt after summer rain, about her mother's small farm and the animals they had saved together and the ones they hadn't been able to save, and how her mother had taught her that you grieve the ones you lose and you keep going for the ones still living. She told him about the church, about standing at the back of the aisle and seeing the faces turn away and understanding in a single horrible moment that the people she had loved most had chosen their own comfort over her dignity. She said it without bitterness, in the quiet, factual tone of someone speaking a truth they have finally stopped being ashamed of. She told him that she had driven until she ran out of road and walked until she ran out of strength and ended up in a cold barn in Montana with her hand on a dying horse, and that it had been, despite everything, the first moment in a very long time that she had felt she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Danny, fading and shaking and barely conscious, said, "Don't stop talking." So she didn't. Wyatt found them 2 hours and 40 minutes later. Danny was alive. Evelyn was barely conscious, her hands shaking badly, her lips pale, her body having given most of what it had to keeping the younger man warm. Wyatt lifted her into the truck without a word, and his hands were not steady. They had not been steady since the moment she drove away into the storm, and he had stood in the yard watching the truck lights disappear into the white and felt something move through him that he had not felt in 7 years. The specific terror of caring again, the horrifying vulnerability of having something left to lose. That night, after Danny was safe and the herd was sheltered and the storm had finally passed, Wyatt sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table while Maria forced warm soup into both of them. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows something that was almost a catastrophe and wasn't. He sat with his hands around his coffee cup for a long time. "Clara used to say this ranch had a way of knowing what it needed," he said finally, his voice low and careful, the voice of a man dismantling something wall by wall. "I never believed her. I thought that was just something she said to make the hard years feel like they had a reason." He was quiet for a moment. "I believe it now." Evelyn looked at him across the table. "You saved more than the cattle," he said. "You know that." She looked down at her hands. "I just did what needed doing." "No," Wyatt said quietly. "You did what nobody else was willing to do. There's a difference. There's always been a difference." Spring came to Bitterroot Valley the way it always does, suddenly, as if the mountains exhaled after months of held breath. The fields went green almost overnight. The creek ran clear and loud. The cattle moved through the new grass fat and unhurried, carrying no visible memory of the winter that had nearly finished them. The town of Millhaven had learned, through the slow and unstoppable movement of truth, what Evelyn Carter had done. The county report was public record. Danny Reeves had talked. Maria had talked. The 3 families whose herds grazed on Wyatt's land had talked, quietly, and with the particular sincerity of people who understood exactly what they nearly lost. And the same people who had stood in a church in Oklahoma and let a woman walk into her own humiliation without a single warning, or people very much like them, now had to hold in their minds the image of that same woman crawling through a Montana blizzard to pull a young man out of a snowdrift and then going back to work the next morning. But by then, Evelyn Carter no longer needed anything from them. Not their approval, not their guilt, not their revised opinion of her worth. She had stopped needing those things somewhere between the barn at midnight and the kitchen table in the dark after the storm. She had found something steadier than approval. She had found usefulness. She had found belonging. She had found in the most unexpected place and in the most painful possible way that she was someone worth staying for. On a bright morning in early April, the old bay gelding stood in the far pasture watching over a newborn foal, small, uncertain on its legs, already beautiful in the way that new things are always beautiful. The first foal born on the Bitterroot Ranch in 3 years. Evelyn was at the fence watching them when she heard Wyatt's boots in the wet grass behind her. She turned, and he was holding something in both hands, a piece of oak, cut smooth and stained dark, with letters carved carefully and slowly into it, the kind of work a man does late at night when he is trying to say something that words have always failed him on. It read, "Brooks and Carter, Bitterroot Ranch." She looked at it for a long time. The morning was bright and cold, and somewhere above the ridge, a hawk was turning slow circles in the blue sky, and the foal was taking its first uncertain steps in the green grass, and the world was very quiet. "You don't have to decide anything today," Wyatt said. His voice was low. "I just needed you to know that as far as I'm concerned, you were home the moment you walked through that barn door. I was just too stubborn and too scared to say it sooner." Evelyn Carter had walked out of her own life on a rainy night in Oklahoma, wearing a dress that cost her mother 8 months of quiet sacrifice. She had driven until she ran out of road and walked until she ran out of strength and found herself in a dying barn in Montana, alone and ashamed, and certain, more certain than she had ever been of anything, that no one in the world would ever truly, openly, without reservation, choose her. She reached out and took the sign with both hands. She was wrong, and being wrong had never in all her life felt so much like grace. If this story found something in you, if you have ever been overlooked or started over or discovered that the place you belong was nothing like the place you expected, then Desert Heart was made for you. We tell these stories because they are true in the ways that matter most. Subscribe now, ring the bell, and come back every week for stories about ordinary people who carry extraordinary courage in quiet ways. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever found home somewhere you never expected? We read every single one. The significant value of this story lies in what it quietly teaches without ever announcing it. It raises awareness of a real and ongoing environmental issue, heavy metal contamination from abandoned mines, which affects rural communities and livestock across the American West. It honors the intergenerational transfer of practical knowledge, particularly the kind passed from mothers to daughters through hands-on work rather than formal education. It portrays grief as something that does not end, but can be slowly transformed through purpose, labor, and human connection. And at its heart, it is a story about dignity, the dignity of a woman who was publicly humiliated and chose, without vengeance and without performance, to become someone worth choosing. For older American audiences who grew up valuing hard work, loyalty, and quiet courage over loud declaration, this story speaks in a language they already know and deeply trust.